Hello and welcome. This is the 8th SMT Power Talk for social media today. I'm David Amerland, and we're discussing today one of the most cogent, probably current topics that we have had for some time, which is personas versus personality in social media marketing. And with me today, I have two sterling guests. I have Ammon Jones from Ammon Jones & Co. and Lee Smallwood from Nodex.com. And they've both been here before, and they were with us in June when pretty much they created a near meltdown for G+, because the conversation they started went on and on and on and on. And we're hoping to basically touch pretty much the same sort of pitch as we tackle this subject. So without further ado, let's start the conversation, and we'll start off with Lee. And I'm going to pose a question, as in, Lee, we used personas in the past in terms of marketing. Do we still use them? Do you think they still have a currency?
I mean, it is $1 million question. Yes, personas definitely do have a place, more so I think than ever before. But I think trying to create a persona for an actual large brand is bordering impossible, because there are so many personalities that if you look at, from a large brand perspective, how can a large brand have a single voice? When it's made up of all of these different individuals who are perfectly capable of discussing, say, an area within their business unit, because they're knowledgeable about that area. Therefore, the way they write, the way, the tone, the whole conversation that they have, it comes across as transparent and honest and believable more than anything. Yeah. And I think as soon as you try and squish all these different areas together, you get a voice which isn't believable. It uses words which people won't necessarily understand. Words generally potentially won't align with what people are talking about anyway, because rather than an alignment of words, copy, imagery, or content, what you're getting is purely from a corporate perspective of what they want to discuss, yeah, as opposed to what should be discussed, i.e., answering people's questions.
Okay. Brilliant, and that's fantastic, because I think that frames the argument quite nicely. And if we take the same question to Ammon, please.
Well, I think personas, yeah, absolutely still have a place, because one of the trickiest things that companies are still struggling with is integrating all of these different channels together. They're offline and they're online, they're digital, they're television, they're print, all of these things together. Now, if you've built up a strong persona on TV, somebody is representing you regularly on TV, you kind of almost are forced to continue some of that online as well. And I think a lot of companies need to start thinking of, okay, I've got, for one not so great example, I've got a fat opera singer on TV as my main face there. Maybe I need the same thing on social media. And it's not that they're going to be talking for the company, but they are going to be acknowledged as a spokesperson for the company. And they are then enabled to have their own persona, their own free reign to be a personality, without it necessarily being, this is the word of the company. It's, this is the word of this person who speaks for the company or represents something that we want to bring across. And it could be a comedy element, it could be that you've got a scientist who is particularly interested in one application of this thing, it could be an engineer, whatever. But I think getting a genuine personality that isn't necessarily trying to represent the company is a great way of combining those two things. It's a persona for the company, but it's an actual personality as well.
Yeah,
that's brilliant. And on that note, personality. Now, we talk about personality in social media and how important it is to actually connect on one-to-one. And the question has to arise now. If you create a persona, which is essentially a construct, does it really leave any kind of room for a real personality, or are we just winging it? And I'll take this one to Lee, please.
That's almost like an analogy of how an actor learns his lines, right? Can an actor be believable? You look at Leonardo DiCappuccino, as I like to call him. He's done so many different roles. but they all tend to be believable. Or you look at these iconic actors, and you believe them. All right, they get into the part, they know it. So, you know, from Ammon's persona example, you know, where you have some furry animal or you have some fat opera singer, yeah, then basically it's like if someone's representing that persona, then basically what you have is you get someone who's in character and then can step out of it again.
Okay,
right?
and how does that affect the audience in terms of their perception of authenticity, for instance? Because we talk a lot about it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think if it's something which is introduced and it creates a dissonance, then there's going to be a huge difficulty, right? You know, but if it aligns with, did I say, we're talking about personas, but the personality of the brand, as opposed to a persona, you know, then if the brand is fun, if it's trying to be, you know, if we're talking about facts and figures, then generally, you know, most people will just switch off after you say, you know, something plus what, you know. But if you can make something which is generally difficult to comprehend from a consumer or customer or client perspective, and put it and package it in such a way that it makes it memorable and easier to digest and understand, like, you know, not wanting to mention things, but, you know, the dummies books, yeah. Everybody knows them, they know what to expect from them, so you could say, you know, you get these little characters on there, and that's kind of that persona. So you understand what you're going to get from it. I think as long as people actually understand what they're going to get from it, and it's believable, it's backed up with, you know, facts as well as the fun part, I think they're on to a win.
Okay, and I mean, could we say, I suppose, that perhaps it is a case of carefully framing the communication that's taking place, maybe. But let's take that point to Ammon, please. Ammon, is it a question of just framing things, and does it compromise authenticity in your point of view?
The biggest question that the business is going to have to deal with, and it doesn't matter whether you're going with a personality or a persona really, but you perceive it more in personas, is this person going to be enabled to speak freely? Do they have to come and get a written script?
Yeah.
And if so, how long does it take to get that script written and signed off by legal and made sure that it fits the corporate image? Because with social media, you need to react in real time. At most, you need to react within 30 minutes to an hour of having seen that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to see it pretty soon after it happens.
Yeah.
So, okay, something happens the opposite time zone and you're mostly based in one country, fine, you can go 8 hours before they expect you to have seen it, but in 9 hours you'd better have an answer.
How would you say, I mean,
usually won't go that fast.
I was going to bring in the T question here, and how do you think all this kind of timeline, perhaps the complexity of the answers which have to be created, how does this affect the perception of trust at the receiving end?
I think that delay really does affect trust, because we know that they're thinking up an answer, and I don't know, it suddenly seems very manufactured, and it suddenly seems very fake, and it seems like one of the things they're weighing up is, what can we get away with saying? What's the least we can say, or what's the best way we can dodge this? Instead of, if I ask you a direct question, you give me a direct answer, I know it's honest.
Yeah.
And the faster that is, the more I know that's come straight from the surface of your mind. You know, you didn't even have to stop and really think about this. You knew the answer. It's a genuine answer. That's kind of where we need to go, which is why whether you're having a personality or a persona, they need to have the ability to answer for themselves. And it may not represent the whole company, but that doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah.
Sometimes all we want is a spokesman to say yes or no, or say, well, I haven't checked into that personally, but I don't like the idea of it, and I know there is an investigation going on.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you want a company to step up, right? That's what you're asking, really. Okay, so, and we're taking this to Lee now, and essentially, you know, we talk about social media, we say personality, authenticity, trust, the really key issues. But when you're running a business, you're there to make money, you're there to create sales, because without them you're going to starve. How do you square this circle? And because the bigger and more successful the business becomes, the more difficult the issue. Where would you start from?
Certainly, I think the brands that we've had the luxury and pleasure of working with, it is a challenge, right? Because you get good people who are naturally at the front of or confront their business unit, right? They're very good. They speak, how they type as they speak. If they're posting or reply, and and they're constantly engaging. However, with companies like this, there's always a shift, and people move around. I mean, you just have to look at Google, and Vic Tundra's leaving, and someone else moves in instead of him, and then there's a whole new learning curve, and all of this kind of stuff. But I think if you find people that are naturally using social media anyway, then encourage them to do more, because it's not false to them yet. If you've got someone who's not so good front of house, I mean, it'd be like having a maitre d' in a restaurant or whatever, and they're just so aggressive and whatever, and you go over there and no, you're not having it. It's just not going to happen. It's just not going to work. It'd be like, no, you're not on social media. You're not working with us.
Wouldn't that mean that the question of trust is a question that hasn't been answered, not just at the customer interface of a large company with its audience, but also internally?
Definitely. I mean, from a trust perspective, if someone is speaking as them, as you were saying before, and Ammon was saying before, it doesn't really matter if it's, not necessarily the answer we want right now. It might be like, okay, that doesn't really satisfy me, but thanks for speaking your mind. Whether I agree with it or not, there's an element of trust coming in, because they're saying, no, it can't be because of this, or we can't do that because of that, or actually, you know what, I'm going to take care of this. And they take ownership of it. And that immediately, even though you might not necessarily know who that person is, they're replying on behalf of a brand page or personality or persona, profile, but immediately you align more with them. You go, you know what, fantastic, thank you.
Ownership. Okay, that's the old word now. And let's take this to Ammon, because this is important. Ammon, how do we take ownership of this conversation, of the tasks which are at hand in a social media environment, when you're working for a large company, or even a small one, where then the pressures of the day must be immense?
For the smaller company, it's sometimes tougher, because you've got so many different jobs to do already that the last thing you can do really is spend all of your time keeping your ears open and looking for opportunities to respond and interact. So in that respect, the large company can have the dedicated social media people, and literally you can create a sort of adjutant role where they know key people in the company, and their job is to channel what would they say, but with their own personality. So they are kind of the assistant to, who then steps out and speaks up and gives you what they would say, but they're doing it in their own voice. So you're getting that realistic, instant human response. You're getting the authority of the fact that they know this person personally and have experience with how they usually answer this question. So
how realistic is that, though? I mean, seriously, because when it comes to social media crisis, within inverted commas,
Groundswell.
yeah, speed and responsibility are critical, and who's going to take that?
I don't think it's unrealistic. Let's face it, a lot of politicians have exactly that kind of person, and they don't have nearly the budgets that a big corporation does.
Very true.
And they manage it, yes, exactly, yes. So if we go back to that example, now obviously there's a dynamic there which works in one area and which hasn't really been addressed and transferred into another, like a large corporate. So if you were to advise a business how to set it up, how would you start?
I would literally be hiring almost a virtual assistant, but it's a personal assistant whose job it is to talk to the other departments to kind of channel your voice all through inside the company as well as outside. So literally, this person, their job is to learn how you react to things and then channel you in various situations, and that would include social media. And I think that way you can have key personnel who are communicating better throughout the company and throughout social media, and really getting that communication to the level where technology has evolved, where we expect that.
Yeah.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. And let's take the question to Lee now, because we're talking about discussion and communication both internally and externally, and the question has to be, what are we going to talk about exactly? How would a company even begin to start a conversation?
Certainly not like a bull in a china shop, for one. You've got the old methods, which unfortunately, some companies, that's all they know. Yeah, I think you mentioned this before. There's a bunch of people over there. I call it a PR bomb, and you throw a message right in the middle of it, and you see how many people are left standing. But then 90% of the people have just kind of gone, whoa, yeah. You're just grateful.
Mow those down with direct mail.
Yes, absolutely. But I think from an engagement perspective and how to converse with people, it still comes back to the same old thing. If we start by listening first, find out what people want to talk about, whether it's a service, a product, a company, whatever, because you can guarantee that there are people out there that are not listening and still pushing or broadcasting a message.
Okay. I think that's important, and you bring up a really important point now, which perhaps begins to touch upon the practicalities of all this. How do you begin to listen? Where do you start from? Let's say you're brand new to the social media, relatively speaking. You've got a company, you're coming in, and you really now need to respond, listen, start the whole thing.
Yeah, without kind of going into or showing a bias thing, there are a lot of applications out there that will enable any brand, small or large, to listen to conversations. All right, and so how people phrase a question, questions are always the great thing to listen to, because anybody can answer it from a product, brand, or service perspective, if that's your niche area, And if you can answer it, great, answer it. If you can't answer it, then move on to the next one, or the next one, or the next one, till you find something that you're comfortable with replying to and engaging on. You're not therefore pushing something which you are trying to sell. What you're then doing is providing a value to or answer to a question. You're building up a persona on other people's posts which aren't pushy. They're not hard sell. There's no snake oil, and people will naturally gravitate to you or your brand by doing it that way.
Okay. And Ammon, same question. Where do you start from your listening strategy? Where does it start from?
There's two parts to this. The first one is that role I was talking about earlier of somebody who can channel you. They should also be channeling back. They should be conversing and always letting the person they report to know what conversations are important, what questions keep coming up, because those obviously are things that need to be addressed on a wider scale. And that's exactly what you do with tools and with the social media as well. A listening strategy, you start off, obviously you listen for mentions of your company, but go beyond that. If your company produces widgets, you should be tracking the word widgets and all mentions of widgets so that you can understand when those conversations are happening. And it's not to jump in and have your say, it's to listen in, because your customers are talking about why they bought you. And the people who didn't become your customers are telling you exactly why they didn't buy from you. Whether it was that they hadn't heard of you, maybe your name hasn't come up, maybe it's because the price, somebody's beating you and you haven't conveyed your value well enough. So a listening strategy is not just listening for mentions of your company or even just your product, but listen for all of those conversations about your market. So if you do account software, try and listen in on as much as you can of conversations regarding accounts, regarding payrolls, regarding taxes. And those things will all give you immediate fuel for what you should be talking about to resonate with your audience in the first place.
That's brilliant. And essentially what you're saying is that there's an educational process, there's a learning curve inside the corporation, inside the company, inside the business, as well as the outside. But this also raises the question, what if you make a mistake? Lee, if we take this to you, what if things do go wrong? Where does it go from there?
I think if things will go wrong because we're human. And, you know, a brand, large or small, should always be learning. This is a fast-moving space, you know, and people's opinions change from one second to the next. You know, they can be swayed by advocates or influencers or other people's opinions, you know, and there is also a herd mentality with social media as well. Some people will just repost something purely just to get on the back end of it, you know. But if you make a mistake, which is going to happen, then put your hands up to it. Just be open and honest, transparent about it, you know, saying, okay, this happened, it shouldn't have happened, and this is what we're going to do now to stop it happening again in the future, you know, because, okay, you're going to get an onslaught of, you know, possibly abuse, depending on the level of mistake that you've done, yeah, but it is a learning curve, and then from that, you'll start looking at, well, if this happened, what else could happen? And you build up this mind map of potential things of like, well, how do we avoid that from happening? How do we avoid this from happening?
Right. It's a case of what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger.
Yeah, pretty much, you know, but be honest with people. And then, you know, you're not necessarily going to get a groundswell there because you say, look, you know, I effed up. Yeah. That's it. Or we effed up. We made a mistake.
That's the ownership question, isn't it, really?
Absolutely.
And if we take this to Ammon now, because essentially, I mean, the moment you step up and acknowledge these things, you become, in a sense, a lightning rod.
Mm.
And I'm really interested to see how would you then manage expectations? How do you recover from there?
Well, let's have a little look at a case. A while back, an airline had the worst possible mistake in error of judgment that you could possibly have. They responded to negative criticism with a pornographic image of a model aeroplane put somewhere one should never land.
Oh, wow.
Now, we all know what case we're talking about,
yep.
And you haven't thought about it for 2 weeks, have you?
No.
Think how big a level of mistake that was, and it's already blown past. And we're not talking about that far ago. So, yeah, even the very worst mistakes you can imagine blow over, provided you own up, you find out what caused it, and if it was massively inappropriate, that somebody loses their job, that's it. You know, you take responsibility. And I think that some of what we've been talking about today, where if you're a large corporation, instead of having these ghost accounts posting on behalf of the whole brand, you make sure people know who is behind it, that there is a kind of responsibility.
Mm.
Even if it's a team, you know where this team is. There should be an area of the site that explains who's on this team and what that team's about. Mm. So much of that is already headed off. You know exactly where the meltdown is.
It's not a transition now that we're making from personas, which were essentially artificial, run by anybody, to real personalities where we actually make people accountable and give them a voice, and that voice becomes the voice of the company or the brand or the business.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
I think it's still possible to have the personas as well. I think it's still possible to have Darth Vader and know that it's Keith Prowse inside, and it doesn't matter. You know, we're used to, as long as when something goes wrong, we are able to know who the actor was inside. I think you can have that persona and still know, you know, who's accountable. So let's take the example of some of these actors. Let's face it, a lot of actors, the persona that comes across, the way we know them, probably isn't recognisable to their family and friends.
Yeah.
Even on talk shows, they come across in a certain way, particularly some of the action stars and the manly men, but also some of the funny ones where, you know, they can't be funny all of the time. We accept that. and we still know who's accountable when it goes wrong. So I think you can have a persona that doesn't have to be exactly the same as the personality, as long as you know where that accountability lies. That's the part that absolutely has to be genuine.
Okay, and let's bring up a difficult question now, because we brought up personas and personalities, actors and acting. So in social media, to some degree, are we acting? Is it a stage? Is it just a stage? Lee?
I think, I mean, that's a fantastic question. Is it a stage? I think for people that struggle, you know, let's look at it from a small business perspective. You know, you have to wear multiple hats because you don't have the resource available to you necessarily to get a virtual assistant, you know, to manage those things. So you have to do it. So those first days, weeks, months, sometimes years coming through, you struggle until you find your voice. And your voice generally that you find is your natural voice, i.e. it's you, because you're comfortable at being you. And then comes the thing, or the decision to be made from a small brand perspective, is there a way to split you between personal and business, you know? And sometimes, you know, there isn't. On other times, you may feel a little bit more protected or more confident, not protected, more confident by splitting yourself. This is how I am when I'm at work. This is how I am when I talk personal, or you know, from a personal perspective. But it's a very difficult thing. You've got to find your voice. You've got to feel comfortable.
And how do you find that voice, Ammon? What would you suggest that a business can do?
There's two great words that have come up there: stage and voice. And I think that's actually one thing to look at. A lot of social media, you should think of it a bit like speaking at a conference. You're being genuine, but you're also learning how to talk to the public. And sometimes that's as simple, and this really does translate to social media. You find a few people in the audience and you speak directly to them. And we've all learned that when we're speaking at conferences, you look a few people in the eyes and the whole audience feels involved.
Absolutely.
As your attention moves around. But you're talking to those specific people, and that makes it much easier for you. And that's exactly what we do with marketing, and particularly in social media and digital marketing. Talk to the customer you want to be talking to. And when you do that, you find your authentic voice so much sooner, and you speak more authentically because you're imagining that conversation, and it's working even when you haven't got a face in front of you, and you've got a camera or a Facebook page or whatever that is.
I think also it's like, talk passionately about it. If you can't talk passionately about what you do, all right, or it just comes like you've been given a script, you know, you're in sales and this is what you've got to say, you know, it's kind of like a telesales call or something, you know. If you can't talk passionately about what you do, then how are you ever going to be believable, you know?
It's so true. I mean, that's fantastic. What a huge insight from both of you to actually finish on, because we're getting near the end of a half hour. So let's begin to wrap up, and I'm going to start with Lee, please. And if I say, you know, if you wanted to give advice to somebody who is starting out on social media, they want to be as genuine as possible, they want to perhaps mitigate risk in terms of how they open themselves up, what would you say?
Okay, there's a couple of things here. One, I would start by engaging on posts that motivate me, first of all. If I'm not used to social media, there's no better way of getting into it by taking part in an existing conversation. You know, how does this feel? You can test certain words out. Reading the commentary, you can see the tone that people are using. You can also see the impact that other people are having on a conversation or ensuing conversation. That would be my first thing. And that could actually generate ideas for writing a post. First, you know, maybe your first post from there, and therefore you could also reference that conversation. So it's being done in the right way, or certainly from how I would do it. The second thing is that before putting anything out, before putting anything out publicly, when you first start, even now, you know, get someone to reread it first. all right? Because your interpretation, and I've done this, you know, unfortunately I've got Polly here, right? But I write things sometimes, and I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I think. And then Polly says to me, you know what, it could also be thought of this way. And I'm like, no, I didn't mean it that way. So, you know, let alone from a grammatical perspective, get someone else's opinion to clarify what your meaning is, and it may mean you rewrite it or add a different image.
Right, and the same question to Ammon. Ammon, how would you start advising people to begin in this kind of space, which is so fraught with risk?
The very first thing is to realise how important it can be, and one of the things that we spoke about briefly in the green room before we came on is that the big change over the last 30 years is how much difference it can make when a company has a clear personality involved. And the example I brought up was Virgin, and how Richard Branson enabled Virgin to consistently punch above its weight all the time. It was up against much bigger businesses, and every single time the personality of Richard Branson and his ability to speak as a person really took that company forward. So, you know, when you were looking at Virgin versus British Airways looked terrible. They had no idea of personality, so they had no connection with people, and people had no connection with them. Another great example that Lee said was Apple and Steve Jobs, how Steve Jobs really did kind of embody an ethos within Apple. And it'll be interesting to see how that may decline over time, because my counter to that was, or rather something that illustrates that, was how Microsoft has seemed less and less relevant to me personally since Bill Gates stepped down. Even Steve Ballmer didn't have the same kind of investment. You know, Bill Gates was passionate about what he did, and the company reflected his direction. So you knew that not only was he speaking, but he was speaking from a position of authority. He understood what was really going on behind the scenes.
And he's back now, right? He's going to give 30% of his time back to the company as an advisor. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. You're quite right.
But it can create, if it goes wrong, it can create this divide, and then all of a sudden, you know, you lose some loyalty with a brand. I know since, you know, Steve Jobs passed, it was like it was never this. It's never been the same.
Yeah.
It's never been the same.
Yeah, which is again, it's how you manage that personality transition, really, isn't it? What you both have been saying all along, really, because Apple is undergoing a transition of sorts.
Yeah, and one of the other things that we were talking about was it doesn't have to be one personality for the whole company. If you look at Google, there's lots of different departments. If you're in SEO and marketing, we know Matt Cutts, and he's probably our face of Google to us. But for a lot of other people, it's Ammon Agarwal, or it's Larry Page. You know, so there are different personalities for different parts of it. And for a lot of webmasters, John Mueller, of course, is their face, because that's the person they're used to dealing with. So don't necessarily think that one person has to be your whole company. By all means, have different spokesmen for different parts of it.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. And with that, we wrap up. This is Social Media Today on Social Media Power Talk, number 8 in a row. We've got 4 more to go until the end of the year. Both Ammon and Lee did a fantastic job today. We're tremendously grateful to both of them for their time and insights. Stay tuned for updates for the next show, and thank you very much. This is David Amerland signing out.